Okay, we are beginning today. We are going to be studying one of the most beautiful Haftarot of the year, and it's so beautiful that we read it twice. We have the Haftarah for Parashat Behaalotecha. Also, same exact Haftarah, same beginning, same ending. Sometimes you have overlap. This is exactly the same full text that we read on Shabbat Chanukah. Common denominator is the Menorah. I'm just going to thank you. Okay, so I'm going to leave myself something to talk about in case we're still doing Haftarah on Shabbat Chanukah, when Chanukah comes around. So we're not going to focus on all the parallels with Chanukah and why this was chosen to be the Haftarah of Shabbat Chanukah, which we'll get to, hopefully. But we are going to focus on sort of why does it belong here? And what's really interesting is why Chazal chose to highlight this aspect of Parashat Behaalotecha, because we know that the Haftarah is usually chosen to reflect a major theme in the parasha. There are different theories as to how the custom of reciting a Haftarah originated. One of the theories is that it was during a time of shmad, of persecution, when we were not allowed to study the Torah itself, and therefore texts were chosen from the Nevi'im that reflected major themes of what would be the Parashat HaShavua, and that was sort of a, coming in through the back door, a way of studying the Torah without the Torah text itself. It's not clear that at all that that's really how the custom originated, but it is a theory. In which case, we would expect that the Haftarah would reflect a major theme in the parasha. Now, Parashat Behaalotecha does open with the teaching about the Menorah, but it is not the primary place where we find the mitzvah of the Menorah, the mitzvah that goes in Sefer Shmot, along with the other kelim of the Mishkan, all the detailed instructions of what the Menorah is going to look like, and most of the details associated with the Menorah are found there. Here it's a very short, you have 3 psukim in the beginning. Tell Aharon, when Aharon lights the Menorah each day, this is how it should be done, and then we move on to a lot of other topics in Parashat Behaalotecha. Some of it is narrative, the part where OUisrael are traveling through the Midbar, they complain about the lack of meat, and we have the slav, and that's the narrative part. There are other mitzvot. The Chatzotzrot are one of the highlights of Parashat Behaalotecha. So it seems an odd choice that Chazal chose this particular Haftarah, which most people associate with, that's the Haftarah of the vision of the Menorah. Why is that chosen for this week's parasha? So we'll come back to that. The Haftarah consists of 3 distinct units. It opens up with a broad nivu'ah. Again, the words are just beautiful. It consists of 3. It's sequential. It's consecutive. It continues beginning from where it begins in Perek Bet Pasuk Yudalid all the way through Perek Dalid Pasuk Zayin. So it's 3 different prakim, the end of Bet, all of Gimel, and the beginning of Daled. So it's not, Perek Daled does continue, so it's 3 consecutive visions. But again, it's 3 separate pieces that somehow combine to form one whole, and that's another question that we want to address, is how do these 3 pieces combine to form one whole idea? So the Haftarah opens in Perek Bet, Roni v'simchi bat Zion, ki hineni va v'shachanti b'tochech ne'um Hashem. Rejoice, be happy, bat Zion, the daughter of Zion, because behold, I am coming, says Hashem, and I will once again dwell within you So says Hashem, V'nilvu goyim rabim el Hashem bayom hahu. Many nations will be brought to Hashem on that day. V'hayuli la'am, but you will be for me a nation. You will be my people. V'shachanti b'tochech. Again, the reiterated promise, Hashem will live in you. Hashem's presence will be found in Yerushalayim. V'yadat ki Hashem tzvakot shlachani elecha. And this is Hashem saying through the Navi, you'll know that I'm for real. V'nachal Hashem et Yehuda chelko al admat hakodesh uvachar od b'Yerushalayim. Again, Hashem says, Yehuda will be my nachala, and Yehuda will be restored to its proper place in Eretz Yisrael, and Hashem will once again make his choice of Yerushalayim clear. Has kol basar mipnei Hashem. The entire world will be hushed, silenced in the presence of Hashem. Ki ne'or mimakon kodsho. Everyone will be aware of Hashem's presence in the world because he will be awakened from his holy place. Now, obviously, Hashem is not sleeping. That's a metaphor for Hashem. It seems to us, there's consensus among the commentators here, which is always nice when that happens. It seems to us that Hashem is sleeping because things are happening that, we cause us to say, where is God in all this? And how could this be happening? And then all of a sudden, has kol basar, be silenced, because Hashem has, so to speak, woken up. It becomes very clear, here is Hashem. And that's these psukim, that this nivuah of things are going to be bad, complicated, painful, and in an instant, v'ne'or Hashem is going to, so to speak, awaken, and everyone will recognize his presence, everyone will recognize his choice of Eretz Yisrael, of Am Yisrael. This will be universally acknowledged. Radak says, Roni v'simchi yitachen lefaresh nivuah zo ad mima'on kodsho. These psukim from Roni v'simchi until Ma'on kodsho, atida limot hamashiach. This is a nivuah for the future. Radak was writing in the 1200s, I think. So, a long time ago, he said this is not about now and not about something that already happened, but something for the future. And how do we know this? Ba'avur she'amar v'nilvu goyim rabim has kol basar, because there's a universal aspect to this nivuah. As much as it highlights how precious Bnei Yisrael are in the eyes of Hashem, and I choose you, and I will reside among you, still it's something that's acknowledged and welcomed by the entire world. So that universality, he says, Lo ra'inu ze bebayit sheni. We did not see this when Bnei Yisrael returned to Eretz Yisrael to build the second temple, and we haven't seen it since then. So therefore, it's talking about the future. It hasn't happened yet. We're still awaiting that day. And it's, again, beautiful, beautiful nivuah. There are many parallel nivuot, especially in Yeshayahu, of all the nations coming to Yerushalayim, acknowledging Hashem as the one God and Yisrael as his people.
Why does it go back and forth from Hamikdash HaShishit to Beis Hamikdash HaSheni?
Okay, so Zechariah's nivuot in general are not so clear. We're about to see two of his visions. He experiences a series of visions that are not clear even to him. And he has a malach, he calls him hamalach hadover bi, the malach who is speaking from within me, who helps, he's sort of his guide to the imagery of these visions. And he keeps saying to him, he prompts him, what do you see? And Zechariah tells him, he says, what do you think it means? And there's this back and forth between them, which is really interesting. So Zechariah is a Navi at the beginning of Bayit Sheni. Most of his prophecy, or much of his prophecy, deals with the time in which he lived, which was when the people were just beginning to build Bayit Sheni, or resume the building of Bayit Sheni after the enemies had stopped it during the time of Achashverosh. And a lot of his nevuah is to encourage them to resume the building. He goes along with Chagai. They're paired together, Chagai and Zechariah. Chagai's nevuot are very simple, straightforward. Zechariah's are very complex visions that, again, he himself doesn't always understand. So clearly he has messages for the people of his time. He also has messages for the future, and they are sort of interwoven one with another. sometimes within the same nivuah, as we'll see, and sometimes there's one section and another section. It's not even clear that that were spoken at the same time. Given that his nivuah was taking place at the beginning of Bayit Sheni, when the level of kedusha was much lower than any of the other Nevi'im who preceded him, his own level is, as a Navi, is obviously he's a Navi, so he's a tremendous tzaddik, and for us to sit here and say, oh, he wasn't on such a high level, like that's a degree of chutzpah. But at the same time, he doesn't come close to the level of the earlier Nevi'im, and therefore his Nevuot are a little bit blurry. So these are the last, it's Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the last Nevi'im. Yeah, so it's just at the very beginning. These are people who were alive in earlier times. So it's like the last vestiges of Nevuah, the last traces of Nevuah. That's why you get this lack of clarity and going back and forth between different topics and different time periods. It's a little bit obscure because Nevuah is ending. It's in that, it's sort of petering out. And you feel that. You feel that in the Nevuah. The third, he doesn't, when we have details about the third Beit HaMikdash, they're difficult for us to comprehend. You have the whole section at the end of Yechezkel, where, describing in a lot of detail the third Beit HaMikdash. We just don't know what all those details mean. So his Nevuot were definitely relevant to his time. It was what the people of his time needed to hear. But obviously, if they were recorded, and this is true of every Navi speaks to his time period. What he's saying has to be relevant and meaningful to the people that he's talking to, but not exclusively. And that's why what was recorded were the things that resonate, that resonate throughout all the generations and have relevance in our own time as well. If it wasn't relevant, it doesn't mean that there were many, many more Nivi'im and Nivuot than were recorded. Right? The Gemara says there were over 1 million Nevi'im in OUisrael, but only 48 men and 7 women had their words recorded, because what was recorded were the things that were relevant for the future as well. But there were a lot of other prophecies floating around that may have been very specific to a person's situation at that time and place. Okay, back to... He is in Eretz Yisrael. He is among those who... Yes, Chagai and Zechariah are among those who returned in the second wave, not with the first group, but they come a little bit later. And again, they're trying to energize the people to begin building again after the building had stopped, and there was a sense of despair and a lot of problems within the nation, as we'll see. We'll see some of them, and they were trying to get things restarted. Obviously, b'dvar Hashem. It wasn't their own idea. Let's start. It was they were relaying the word of Hashem that build, like get going. Okay. So that's the first beautiful piska, even if it were just that, but that sounds very much like a nevuah from Yeshayahu as well, and reiterates a lot of ideas that we do see in Yeshayahu as well. In Perek Gimel, we see something very characteristic of Zechariah, and that is this vision that is a little bit more difficult to understand. Vayar'eni et Yehoshua HaKohen HaGadol omed lifnei malach Hashem v'hasatan omed al yemino l'sitno. The Vayar'eni, he showed me, meaning Zechariah's sort of tour guide through his visions, shows me a vision of Yehoshua Kohen Gadol. Yehoshua was the spiritual leader of Shivat Zion, of those who had returned earlier, say with Ezra, to build in the first round, following the decree of Koresh, allowing the people to build the Beit HaMikdash. He was the spiritual leader, the Kohen Gadol, who had returned among them. So Zechariah, in his vision, not in real life, although Yehoshua was alive at that time, so he's seeing something contemporary with him now. He sees Yehoshua standing before Malach Hashem, and the Satan, the prosecuting angel, is standing at his right, prosecuting him. Vayomer Hashem el hasatan, yig'ar Hashem becha hasatan, v'yig'ar Hashem becha, habocher b'Yerushalayim, halo ze'ud mutzal me'esh. Hashem pushes away the Satan. He says, I reject you, and pushes him aside. I reject your arguments. And how dare you? First, Hashem says, I choose Yerushalayim over you. How dare you accuse this man? He is ud mutzal me'esh. He is a firebrand saved from the fire. We see this today, and I think definitely one of the shuls that I've davened in over the years, at least one, had on a memorial wall for victims of the Shoah, and on the bottom it says, Halo ze'ud mutzal me'esh. It's a phrase that is often used in connection with Holocaust survivors, a firebrand saved from the fire. So what does this mean here? Ibn Ezra explains, according to the simple pshat, that he's talking about Yehoshua Kohen Gadol, who represented the desire to build the Beit HaMikdash. The Satan represents the enemies of Israel who tried to stop the building of the Beit HaMikdash, those who wrote letters of enmity and hatred to Achashverosh saying the Jews are planning to rebel against you, they're not really building a temple, they're building a fortress, etc. And the building was stopped. And Hashem now says, enough, I push you aside, you enemies of Yerushalayim, I choose Yerushalayim, and those who are trying to stop the Beit HaMikdash, too bad. Halo ze'ud mutzal me'esh, he is someone who survived the galut, the experience of exile. How dare you stand in his way? He has suffered so much. He now wants to return and serve in the Beit HaMikdash. He is deserving of that merit, and the Mikdash will be built. That's the simple explanation of this vision as it pertains to Zechariah's times. The vision continues, V'Yehoshua haya lavush b'gadim tsoim, ve'omed lifnei hamalach. Yehoshua was wearing soiled clothing, and he stood before the malach. So some of you may remember we referenced this text during the series on clothing in Tanakh, that what is the symbolism of Yehoshua's dirty clothes? And everybody said, he would stand before Hashem in soiled clothing. The clothing of the Kohen Gadol was a serious matter. If it got dirty, it had to be thrown out. It's not like it was sent to the laundry and then they wore it again the next day. It was thrown out. It was not even thrown out. It was taken apart, and the threads were used for wicks. But they weren't allowed to wear dirty clothing to perform the avodah. So what does this mean? He's standing before Hashem in soiled clothing? So again, Ibn Ezra says, this pertains to Yehoshua at that time, in that place, the soiled clothing is a symbol of the fact that, as he pointed out, the glory of the second Beit HaMikdash was nowhere near as great as the first. And they didn't have, certain things were missing. So you have, it's in Ibn Ezra source number 4, Yesh Omrim, Ki habgadim hatzauim, we'll come back to the first part of it. Just actually skip to the end of the first line. He says, Vahanachon, but the correct interpretation, we'll go back to the interpretation that he reveals, is not correct. But what he says is the correct interpretation, Hanachon, Ki lo hayalo bigdei kavod v'tifaret, that's the sort of code phrase for Bigdei Kehuna, lechavod, because Hashem says that this clothing should be for you, lechavod v'letifaret, as a sign of dignity, honor, glory. He didn't have that honor and glory and dignity associated with the Bigdei Kehuna. Ki lo hayalahem, rak mizbeach lahakriv ha'olot. All they had at that time was a mizbeach, nothing else. Ve'ein lahem bayit, the building wasn't built yet, velo parochet v'kaporet, they didn't have any of the curtains that divided one section from another, umizbeach hazahav, the golden altar that was used for the ketoret, bigdei zahav, they didn't have the beautiful clothing of the Kohen Gadol, ve'hinei habgadim mashal, she'ein lo kavod v'hadar. So that his soiled clothing represents this idea that there was a lack of glory and beauty at this time concerning the Beit HaMikdash. What happens in the continuation of the vision is that the malach who's standing there, who's his guide, says to the other malachim who are sort of hovering around at the edges of his vision, remove the dirty clothing, remove the soiled clothing from upon him, and Hashem says, you see, I have removed your soiled clothing. He'evarti me'alecha avoncha. I have removed what your sin or your punishment, whatever it is, which apparently was represented by the dirty clothing. Ve'halbeshotcha machlatzot. And now I'm going to put on a new set of clothing. And the malach says, put a pure turban on his head, the tzanif of the Kohen Gadol, v'yasimu hatzanif hatahar al rasho, v'yalbishuhu b'gadim, u'malach Hashem omed. And they dressed him, and he puts on a new set of clothing, and the Malach Hashem continues with the Nivu'ah and says, if you walk in my ways, if you keep my mishmeret, if you do everything that you're supposed to do, then you will achieve the status of the Malachim, you will rise to such great heights. And at the end of the Nivu'ah, there's another image. At the end of Pasuk Chet, Hashem says, or beginning, Shmana Yoshua Kohen Gadol, Ata v'reyecha hayoshvim lefanecha, you and your friends who are among you or with you, and the commentators explain who are his friends. They are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who survived the furnace of Nebuchadnezzar. Those are Zechariah's friends. Ki hinani meviet avdi tzemach. I am going to bring my servant tzemach. We'll have to explain what that means. And then he shows them another vision, which is very difficult to understand. Ki hinei ha'even asher natati lifnei Yehoshua. Here is the stone that I have placed before Yehoshua. Al even achat shiv'a einayim. There are 7 eyes on this stone. Hineni mefateach pituchanu Hashem tzvakot umashti et avon haaretz hahi biyom echad. And I'm going to erase the sins of the land and restore my presence here. Bayom hahu nu'um Hashem tzvakot tikru'u ish l'riehu el tachat gefen ve'el tachat te'ina. And that's a common image in Tanakh, ish tachat gafno v'tachat te'inato, for peace and security, and everybody will be sitting under their fig trees and grape trees and calling to one another, and so there will be peace in the land. That ends with a beautiful vision, but when is this going to happen, and what exactly is going on here? There are a lot of moving pieces here that are difficult to explain. So the Gemara gives us some background to this, which is completely different from Ibn Ezra's. The Gemara tells us a story which is not recorded in the text, but relates to things that are recorded in the text in different places. First of all, we find, Ko amar Hashem tzvakot Elokei Yisrael el Achav ben Kuliah ve'el Tzidkiyahu ben Maaseyah hanib'im lachem b'shmi l'sheker. These are 2 Nevi'im, Achav ben Kuliah and Tzidkiyahu ben Maaseyah, who are mentioned in Sefer Yirmiyahu. They are Nevi'ei Sheker, false prophets, who, and we know that Yirmiyahu had extensive dealings with the Nevi'ei Sheker, who were always trying to discredit him and saying, no, there's not going to be a Churban, he's lying, we're all telling the truth, everything is fine, just ignore him, etc. But here the Gemara tells of even worse things that they prophesied, or they said in the name of Hashem falsely. What happened? The Gemara tells a story that Tzidkiyahu, this Achav and Tzidkiyahu, these 2 false prophets, somehow had access to the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And they went to the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and each of them told her that God said she should have relations with the other. So they were sort of, in the name of, they said that this is in the name of God. Tzidkiyahu says you should lie with Achav, and Achav says you should lie with Tzidkiyahu. She thought this was a little strange that they're telling her this in the name of God, and she went to her father and told him this is what they said. And Nebuchadnezzar said, that doesn't sound like the Jewish God, right? I know a little bit about the Jewish God. I've had experiences. He has Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. He knows, he said, their God is moral. He doesn't tolerate immorality. It can't be that they're really speaking in the name of God. So he wanted to punish them. He called them before him, and they said, he said, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah told me that your God would never permit such behavior. And they said, no, we're also prophets, and we tell you that it is true. And Nebuchadnezzar said, in that case, I'll test you to see whether you're true prophets the same way that I tested them, and I'll throw you into a fiery furnace, and we'll see if you survive like they survived, and then I'll know that you're telling me the truth. So they said, oh, but that's not fair, because there were 3 of them, and there are only 2 of us, so they had more merit than we have. So Nebuchadnezzar said, well, okay, so choose for yourself a 3rd person to go in with you, and you'll also have merit. So who did they choose? Yehoshua, Kohen Gadol. He's a tzaddik. He'll have enough merit to save us. So they chose Yehoshua to go into the furnace with them. The three of them were thrown into the furnace by Nebuchadnezzar. Guess what happened? Yehoshua survived and they did not. So clearly they had not been telling the truth, but, says the Gemara, Yehoshua's garments were singed by the fire. And that's why he's called an Ud Mutzal Me'esh. He was the firebrand saved from the fire. He was alive, but he was slightly burned by the fire. So when he came out, so Nebuchadnezzar said to him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah came out to a whole, and Bri'im Ushleimim. How come you were singed by the fire? So he said, well, there were three of them. and they were all tzaddikim, and I was the only righteous one here, and I had two Rishaim with me. So I was a little damaged because they outnumbered me. And Nebuchadnezzar was satisfied with that response. But Chazal add, why was Yehoshua really punished? Because it did have some effect. So at the very end of the Gemara there, if you want to read through the Aramaic, that's fine, and you have it there for you. But the sort of second to last complete line in the middle of the line, Mai taima ianash, what's the reason that he was punished? Amar Papa, shehayu banav nos'in nashim she'inan hagunot lechehuna. His sons intermarried. Here it just says that they married women who were not permitted to a Kohen, but Chazal tell us in other places the sons of Yehoshua had intermarried. V'lo micha bahen, and he did not rebuke them, he didn't stop them, he didn't protest. He allowed them to marry, which, if it's intermarriage, then it's a big problem. If it's just as it says here, she'inan hagunot lechehuna, it's also a big problem. It's not as big because they married women who might have been okay for another Jewish person to marry, but would prevent them from serving in the Mikdash. It would disqualify them from service. So what's wrong with that? There's no Beit HaMikdash standing at the time when they got married.
Probably a lack of belief that
Yeah, it's a sign of Yeush, like we've given up. And that's a very big problem. We saw the idea previously that Hakol min hakivu, everything is related to tikva. We can never lose hope. Everything, all Yeshuot, Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem, everything Yeshua comes from hope. And if people see that Yehoshua is allowing his sons to marry women who would disqualify them from serving in the Mikdash, it must be because he thinks that the Mikdash is not going to be built. So what if his sons marry such women? They're not, as long as they're still Jewish. If they're still Jewish, then it's fine. They're just not hagunot lekihuna. Okay, the Mikdash is not standing. But it's a signal of despair, of having given up hope, and therefore, because of that, that was considered a sin, and his clothing was singed as a sign of punishment. The Malbim points out that Yehoshua's clothing, the soiled clothing, Hasiru habgadim hatzoim me'alav, ritzono lomar shelo yisa onesh be'avon banav. So Malbim accepts this drasha of Chazal, that Yehoshua was being punished for the sins of his sons. And he says, the removal of the soiled clothing, when Hashem says, take those clothes off of him, it means that he won't be punished for those sins. V'gam yesh l'taretz shebanav gershu neshotehem. Or you could understand it as a symbol, right? If the soiled clothing is taken off of him, then that taking away represents gerushin, that his sons took away or divorced they sent away or divorced their inappropriate wives. Ube'er lo kavanat hamashal, and he explains to him the meaning of this image. Re'eh he'evarti me'alecha avonecha. I have removed your sin. That Hashem says, I'm wiping it away. Ritzono lomar ha'avonot shehem alecha mibachutz al yedei habanim. Now these sins are not intrinsic to Yehoshua himself. That's why they're on his clothing and not on his person. He wasn't burned. His clothing was burned. It's only something that is chitzoni. It's external to him because it's his sons and not him himself. He himself was a perfect tzaddik. That's why the two Nevi'im wanted him to accompany them into the Kivshan HaEsh, because his zechuyot were so clear that he's going to save them. So this is mibachutz. Shehem dimyon ha-bgadim shehem mibachutz. He'evarti, I've taken them off. V'talbesh begadim nikiyim, and now put on clean clothing, meaning Ritzon Olomar tilbash zechuyot tachtehem. The sins are going to be replaced by zechuyot. You'll have great merit going forward. You'll be able to serve in the Beit HaMikdash. And when the Navi sees that his sins have been removed from him, he's the one who says, I also want a tzanif tahor. I want the turban, the hat as well. Because that's the siman of the Kohen Gadol. He says, I want to know that I'm going to return to my status and be able to serve as Kohen Gadol. And Hashem assents to that and says, yes, here, nitkablu divrei hanavi, vayasimu hatzanif al rosho, and they replaced the tzanif to show that he would serve in the Beit HaMikdash. V'gam hilbishu b'gadim shehem yeter bigdei Kohen Gadol, and they put on new clothing, which also represents the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, which until now they had not had, as Ibn Ezra said. And all of this pertains to the meaning of Zechariah's vision as it pertained to his time and place. Yehoshua is being reassured that despite what has happened until now, his sufferings in Galut, being thrown into the Kivshan Ha'ish with two Nevi'ei Sheker, imagine what that must have been for him. A tzaddik like Yehoshua, who maintained his standard of purity throughout the entire time in Bavel, to be thrown into a fiery furnace together with two of the lowest scum who are saying things in the name of Hashem that are completely antithetical to Hashem's teaching. And these are the people he thinks, he goes into that Kivshan Ha'ish thinking he could die. And these are the people he's going to die with. These are his last moments are going to be spent in this kind of company. That was torture to his soul. So having experienced all of this and survived all of this, all he strives for is to return to Kedusha. And he is gifted with this nivuah of Zechariah, who of course related to him, that Hashem has heard you, Hashem has responded to you, and yes, you will once again be able to ascend to the heights of Kedusha. Your tefillot have been answered. Dr. Hirsch points out here, I had mentioned this in the previous shiur on clothing as well, I just think it's a very beautiful idea, that the unclean garments are symbolic of the not untarnished purity of Yehoshua's past, which that's something that only Hashem can remove. Right? Tshuva is something that is uniquely from Hashem. The idea that we can undo something that was done, it's not rational. I think we discussed this a few years ago in Sefer Yonah, when Yonah questions the whole, Tshuva doesn't seem fair. If people sinned, they committed heinous crimes, and they say, I'm sorry, how can they be forgiven? The crime still took place. The losses that were incurred through that crime. Yes. Right. Although here Hashem says, I erased the crime and the punishment. It's understood as both the crime and the punishment. In certain cases, like during the process of tshuva, a person has to experience regret, and then there are also, there could be steps along the way where certain punishment is meted out for the crimes to sort of expiate the crime, but here it's saying there's not going to be a punishment either. The crime is wiped out and the punishment is wiped out. That's something that can only come from Hashem. So the unclean garments are taken off from him, but the pure ones he has to put on himself. Because to atone for the past, only God can do, but to keep the future free from sin lies solely in the power of the person himself. So it's sort of a message to Yehoshua, like, okay, the past, I'm willing to, you already suffered, we're done with the past, I'm wiping the slate completely clean. From here on, only zechuyot, only good things, but you have to make that happen. You have to remain committed to the path of Torah, of following the word of Hashem, in order for those promises to be realized.
Sort of like for us now, too.
It wouldn't be written if it didn't pertain to us. So it's not, and wait, it's going to get even more relevant as we keep going. But yes, the messages certainly are there for us to hear. And not just to hear, but to pay attention and to act accordingly. Okay, Radak explains the term ki hineni mevi avdi tzemach. I'm going to bring my servant tzemach. Who is tzemach? Who or what is tzemach? Hashem says to him, Pershubo ze Zerubbabel. That the Mefarshim, the commentators Chazal, explained that tzemach is a reference to Zerubbabel. Who is Zerubbabel? We sing about him on Hanukkah. Kates Bavel, Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was a person. Zerubbabel was the descendant of the family of David HaMelech, the descendant of the king, who would have been king had kingship been reinstated at that time. They still had the lineage knowing who was the son of whom. It was only 70 years after the Churban, so it's not that long ago. There were still people alive who were around at the time of the Churban, so they knew. Zerubbabel was the one who would have been the king. Yeah, Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel. It's a family name. It comes up. So he's mentioned in Sefer Ezra. We know that Zerubbabel was the one. He was the one who would have been king, and he was the one who led the return to Yerushalayim. When Koresh said, okay, you have permission to go back and build the Beit HaMikdash, Zerubbabel was the leader of the people at that time. V'ta'am mevi. So why did then, if Chazal say that, oh, here the reference is to Zerubbabel, so why does Hashem said, here I am bringing Zerubbabel? He's already there. Ritzono lomar lahagdil od ma'alato v'titzmach gdulato ketzemach ha'adama sheholech v'gadel. So here they say that's why he's called Tzemach and not Zerubbabel. It doesn't say Hineni mevi Zerubbabel, because yes, in fact, Zerubbabel is already there. But this same Zerubbabel who's already there, Hashem says, I will make him grow and blossom and flourish. He's going to continue. His greatness is going to continue. He's on the rise at this point. So that's why the reference is to Zerubbabel, but he's called Tzemach because Tzemach has the implication of something that grows. Tzemach is a plant, so he's going to grow even greater than he is now. V'chein amar od lamata hinei ish tzemach shmo, and in a further vision, Yeshayahu says he again calls a man tzemach, umitachtav yitzmach uvana et heichal Hashem, and he's going to grow and build the mikdash. So that's the implication, that Tzemach, Zerubbabel, who until now has not been successful, now will be successful in building the Beit HaMikdash, and his greatness will continue to grow. V'chein amar Chagai Hanavi, Chagai also says Zerubbabel is going to build the Beit HaMikdash and grow, etc. So then he says, that's one understanding. But then he says, Kmo shepirashnu, v'yesh mifarshim, but there are others who say, Ki Tzemach ze hamelech hamashiach. Tzemach is a name for Mashiach. So this Nivuah, everything that we've been saying until now, that about Yeshua also has implications for the future. And this idea of Hashem says, in addition to the success that you will enjoy now, and you will succeed in building the second Beit HaMikdash, but there will be even greater successes in the future. This Yeshua that I will bring in the future is going to be a Yeshua Gdolah. That's why it's called Tzemach. It's going to grow even beyond the Yeshua of the moment. Va'od darshubo, and they bring a further midrash that Hamashiach Menachem Shmo. That's why many times if a boy is born on Tisha B'Av, which happens a lot, you know that statistically, Shaarei Tzedek has shown that their birth rates rise Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur because fasting, yes. Fasting in your 9th month, not a good idea. I had a baby Motzei Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, right. So a lot of baby boys born on Tisha B'Av are named Menachem because there's this idea that Mashiach will be born on Tisha B'Av, and the Mashiach's name is Menachem. My son is not named Menachem. My brother is Menachem. My son is named Akiva from Akiva Nichamtanu. But it's the same idea, Menachem. So, and they point out that Tzemach in Gematria is the same as Menachem. I didn't figure it out. Usually I do. I don't know. I didn't sit and do the math on this one. You can try, see if it works. And that's how Targum Yonatan translates the pasuk into Aramaic. He says, Yat Avdi Mashiach. Instead of Avdi Tzemach, he says Avdi Mashiach. That Tzemach means Mashiach. So there's this just gives a whole new dimension to the whole Nivuah, that we're no longer talking about Bayit Sheni, but we're talking about the future. Zerubbabel is the political leader of the people who returned to Eretz Yisrael.
Just in Zechariah is mentioned, or?
In Ezra, in Haggai, yeah. I'm trying to think of other places as well. He's a descendant of David HaMelech. Yeah, a descendant of Tzidkiyahu, yeah. So he would have, he's acknowledged that he would have, it was acknowledged that he would have been the king. Whatever the lineage.
Never ascended.
No, there was no kingship doesn't, there is kingship in Bayit Sheni, but it was not Malchut Yehuda. That was the kingship of the Hashmonaim, who usurped the kingship.
What happened to him?
Presumably he died a natural death. We don't, but he did succeed in getting the Mikdash built.
We don't know anything about him.
Not much. And we know that he led the building of the second Beit HaMikdash, which is, I should take back the not much. That's a huge achievement. It's a huge accomplishment. But beyond that, not much.
From him will come the
From
Mashiach.
Be'ezrat Hashem. Right. So, okay. Let's get to the Evan, this weird, the following pasuk with the Evan. Hashem says here, I've placed a stone before Yehoshua, and on the stone are 7 eyes, Shiva Inayim. So Abarbanel explains, Ki hinei ha'evan asher natati lifnei Yehoshua, remez bo el habayit, sheitchil livnot bebayit sheni. The hint is, this is the big stone, this is the cornerstone. He has laid the cornerstone, the foundation of Bayit Sheni. Ki Yaakov kara et Beit HaMikdash ken shene'emar v'ha'even asher samti matzeva yeh Beit Elokim. We find a reference that the site of the Beit HaMikdash, the cornerstone of the Beit HaMikdash was laid by Yaakov. Avinu speaks of the Evan, which I have placed, that will someday become the Beit Elokim. So, Ki'ilu amar she'al habayit ha'atid yiyu shiva einayim. But this Evan is also a symbol for the future. And in the future Beit HaMikdash, there are going to be Shiv'a Einayim, Ritzono Lomar, Sheshiv'at Einei Hashem Behashgachato Ushmirato Yiyu Alav, V'shelo Yeh Habayit Ahu Nivna Biyad Bnei Adam, Ki Im Biyad Hashem Yitbarach. In the future, there's going to be another building, another foundation, another, cornerstone laying ceremony. And that stone is going to carry upon it Shiva Inayim. Now, this does not mean literally, of course, that Hashem has 7 eyes. We can't say such a thing. But it's an expression that we use even today. Ani yashmor alecha b'shiva inayim. What does it mean? Be'ashgacha mle'ah, like with strict supervision. I'm going to watch every move you make. It's an idiomatic expression. B'shiva inayim. 7 is the number of a complete set of Hashem, right? It's the number of creation. So,
Is the 7 Spiros?
yes, absolutely. The 7 Spirot are relevant here. It's with every form of Hashgacha, I'm going to supervise everything that you're doing. I'm going to be watching everything. There's going to be direct Hashgachat Hashem restored at that time. And he says, Hashem yiparach be'atzmo. Hashem, and this mikdash is going to be built by Hashem. This is the Abarbanel obviously is relying upon the midrashic approach that the third Beit HaMikdash is going to descend completely built from heaven. Not everybody agrees with that, but that is one midrashic approach upon which he is relying. And Hashem says that I myself will supervise this third Beit HaMikdash, and it's going to be forever, because obviously if Hashem himself builds something, so to speak, it can't be destroyed. So that this idea of Even Achat, you're starting off with one stone in the time of Yoshua, but in the future I'm going to restore my Shiva Inayim on this very Even. The third Beit HaMikdash will be like a continuation of the second. The second Beit HaMikdash is somehow you getting started, and the human effort to build the second Beit HaMikdash lays the groundwork for the third Beit HaMikdash, which will be a gift from Hashem, which will descend from Shamayim. But it can't happen without the effort that you put in first in this second Beit HaMikdash. So it's a fascinating approach because it combines the two layers of meaning that, here this is a nevuah that applies to Yoshua in his time, but it's also a nevuah that has relevance and resonance up to today. They go together. You can't have one without the other.
So do they say that the third Beit HaMikdash will be more like the second or more like the first?
Not like either, in the sense that it's going to be something completely divine.
So
Right.
then how could they say that it's the
because it's going to like rest on that same rock. It's going to come, that rock is still going to be the bedrock, so the cornerstone. You know, there are stones, if you go, I'm sure many of you have done the Kotel Tunnel tours, and you go and you see the amazing magnitude of the rocks there that, you know, you sit there and say, how could that rock have been moved by man to be put in that place? And it's like, you think of this vision later. I said, I'm placing this rock before you. The rock is there, and we just continue to build upon it.
So you said that you weren't able to accomplish with 5 things, if they're doing it, with the 5 things of the soul, they come back?
The
alone and the...
Yes, that everything that was missing from Bayit Sheni will be restored. Yes. All the Kedusha, the Ketoret, everything that was, all the Simanim of Kedusha and the connection with Hashem that were missing in Bayit Sheni will be restored in Bayit Shlishi. Okay. We haven't mentioned the Menorah, and we're not going to run out of time. And the whole point here is the Menorah. So the third vision of Zechariah in this sequence is Vayashov HaMalach HaDover Bi. Again, the Malach who was speaking from within me returned, Vayeireni, and he woke me up, because apparently Zechariah had fallen into some kind of deep sleep or trance. Ki'ish asher ye'or mishnato, he woke me up as if from a sleep, and he says, Ma ata ro'eh, what are you seeing? And I described to him what I'm seeing. Ra'iti v'hinei menorat zahav kula, v'gula al rosha, v'shiv'a neroteha aleha shiv'a v'shiv'a mutzakot lanerot asher al rosha. So clearly this continues with the theme of the 7 that was described on the Even, and I now saw the menorah, which consists of 7 branches, and on the side, it had 7 wicks, and on the sides of the menorah, on each side there was a zayit, an olive tree, and there was this picture that you have, which is very often associated with this Haftarah that I brought for you, is there are extra bowls there on top. The Navi really only describes one bowl, in which the olives were both gathered and pressed. Whoever the artist was here, I guess, had a hard time with the idea that the olives would be pressed in the same bowl. He has the olives falling into 2 little bowls, one on each side, and then oil being poured into the 3rd bowl, and then which is really the only bowl that the Navi sees, and then from the little bowl in the middle, you can't really see it, but there are 7 sinorot, like pipes, that bring the oil to the wicks. So this is a very self-contained machine, right, that the Navi is seeing, where he sees the whole process of the olives being made into oil and used to light the menorah all on its own. Right? It's a beautiful, beautiful vision. Again, very relevant to Hanukkah. Actually, in the Israel Museum, they have, the last time I was there, they move the Chanukiot around sometimes, but they do have one, an Italian one, that is made in gold and silver, and it depicts this vision very beautifully. But the last time I went, it was like all the way on top. I couldn't get a good picture of it. That's just the menorah itself. But the one in the Israel Museum is an Italian Chanukiah. It's not a menorah, it's a Chanukiah. There's a difference. It has 8 lamps. But it has this vision sort of engraved in the silver behind it. It's magnificent. It's Italian silver, beautifully, beautifully executed. Anyway, if you're ever in the Israel Museum, take a look. So Zechariah sees this magnificent vision, and the Malach says to him, "Can you explain it?" And he says, "No, I don't understand what I'm seeing. I don't know what this is." And the truth is, I think this, in some ways, it's crazy to say, but we have almost an easier time understanding something like this because we have such machines where one action triggers another and things happen on their own. Somebody pushes... Right, and we have commentaries. But Zechariah is seeing this, and he has no idea what's happening here. There's this apparent, the menorah with the olive trees producing olives that are somehow being transformed into oil and piped into the wicks of the menorah. It's all very strange.
When you had Yirmiyahu's vision, at least Hashem explained it,
No, he says, no, Ma'ataro, but he says, I'm on Kel Shaked. He says, Taitav Talirot. Yirmiyahu knew what he was saying. But again, there's a very big difference between Yirmiyahu and Zechariah. Yirmiyahu, the Beit HaMikdash was still standing. Zechariah is, again, his nevuah is much weaker. So the Malach says, what is it? And he says, I don't know, tell me. And the Malach explains to him, Halo yadata mahema. He says, Vayomar lo Adoni. Like, I really don't know. Vayan vayomer elai lemor zed dvar Hashem el Zerubbabel. So again, this is a message to Zerubbabel. This vision is a message to Zerubbabel. Lemor lo b'chayil velo b'koach ki im biruchi amar Hashem tzvakot. Zerubbabel is the political leader of the people. He's the president, right? He can't be the king, so he's the president or the prime minister. And Hashem says to him, lo b'chayil velo b'koach, not through force, not through acts of valor, will the Jewish people be redeemed. Ki im beruchi. You have to give precedent to spirituality. The Yeshua will be brought about in a spiritual way. It's going to be a spiritual victory. And then he says, the Malach says, Mi ata har gadol lifnei Zerubbabel lemishor. You, mountain, you think you're standing in opposition to Zerubbabel? You're going to be flattened into a plain. Anyone who stands before Zerubbabel, who stands in his way and tries to prevent him from accomplishing his mission of building the Beit HaMikdash, will be flattened. V'hotzi et ha'even haroshat shuot chen chen la. And the Evan will be given prominence and will be a sight of glory. Now, the Abarbanel describes the Menorah and its significance, and he says, Ha-Menorah hazot. By the way, what's the symbol of the state of Israel? The Menorah with the emblem. Two atzei zayit, one on either side. This is where they got it from. That's where they took the idea from. This is who we are. Abarbanel says the Menorah represents OUisrael. We are the Menorah. That we are now, the nation had been walking in the darkness, ha'olchim b'choshech, in galut, but hinei la'atid lavo ge'ulata tiyeh menorah me'ira el ever paneha. The ultimate ge'ulah, we are going to be a source of, not only is it our way going to be lit up, but we will be a source of light. That's why the menorah is gold, and it says kula zahav, because the entire nation will be there together. Everybody's going to return. That's why it can't be talking only about Bayit Sheni, because in Bayit Sheni, not everybody returned. Only Yehuda and whoever, whatever, Levium were in Yehuda and parts of Binyamin, whatever. There were a few people outside of Yehuda, but for the most part, it's just the Judean kingdom that returned to Eretz Yisrael to build Bayit Sheni. So Abarbanel says, therefore, it's a menorah kula zahab, the entire menorah, because the entire nation will return in the ultimate geula. And the atzei zayit, one on either side, he said, there's an inequality there, because it doesn't just say one on either side. It says one mi no and mi smolo. And there's a difference between yamin and smol. And yamin is always stronger. So he says there's one on the right. And the message to Zerubbabel is, the one on the right is Yehoshua. The one on the left is Zerubbabel. And the message to Zerubbabel is, you have to allow Yehoshua to take precedence over you. There's always that tension between the political leadership, the spiritual leadership, and the message is, the spiritual leadership has to have the power to override or to direct the political leadership. They have to work together. It's all one system. We're all serving Hashem and lighting up the world. But we have to do that guided by the Spirit. Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi amar Hashem. It's not force that's going to win the day. It's going to be the spiritual battle that has to be won. And that will bring the Yeshua. Right. So, yes, and the first generation for sure, it's problematic, what happens after that first generation, and the fact that they took kingship upon themselves. That is alluded to by the Ramban on the Parsha, where he sees in the menorah of the parsha itself references to the menorah of the Chashmonaim on Hanukkah, and that is borne out in the Haftarah. So when we get to Shabbat Hanukkah and we come back to the Haftarah, we'll look at that aspect of it, that how this vision, there is a lot of parshanot on how this vision relates to Malchut HaChashmonaim. But that's not why we read it on Parshat Behaalotecha. I think that the message here, and again, it's so striking that you have such a short little piece of the parasha that's not even really, it's out of place in terms of the narrative of Sefer Bamidbar. It really belongs more to Sefer Shmot. So why is that what's highlighted by this choice of Haftarah? And I think that it really has to do with this message of Achdut in Am Yisrael. And that is very significant in terms of the travels through the Midbar, when Hashem is saying, think about how you are going to function as a nation. This is what we were meant to do in the Midbar. Think about how we're going to function as a nation once we arrive in Eretz Yisrael. And we have to build the foundations for that kind of existence in the Midbar. The encampment around the Mishkan. So there's a beautiful sforno on the parasha. We don't have time to go into it inside, but very quickly, he describes how the menorah is described here as kaneh echad ba'emtza. There's one central pole, and all the lights the wicks are pointed towards the center. And it's the same idea. He says they're meiminim and this masmeilim, those on the right and those on the left. Same concept. All have to be pointed toward the center to serve Hashem. The ones on the right are those who engage in the study of Torah and developing their spiritual life, and they both sustain and are sustained by the ones on the left, who are the business people, the political leaders, the people who are oskei chayei olam hazeh, those people who are involved in this world. As long as we're all facing toward the center, we're all focused on the fact that we're all here to serve Hashem, we sustain one another. It's like a Yisachar Zvulun kind of relationship, where those who are engaged in the life of daily living and earning a living and conducting whatever political negotiations need to be conducted, obviously are helping the learners, and the learners are sustaining in Torah those who are working in other ways. They're all focused on, we are Am Hashem, and we work together. And as long as that's how we operate, then we will merit, that's what's going to bring about the merit of the Geula. And I really think that's the essence of the choice of the Haftarah for this parasha, is that message of how Am Yisrael needs to function.